everyone. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm coordinator for the Coastal Marine Ecosystem-Based Management Tools Network, the EBM Tools Network, which is co-coordinated by OCTO and NatureServe. And I want to welcome everyone here today. I'm also joined here by Ray Everard from OCTO, who is helping to host this, as well as Sherry Wagner of TNC, who is representing the Reef Resilience Network, which is also co-hosting this webinar. And we are super excited to have David Meyers of the Conservation Finance Alliance and Venkat Iyer of UN Environment here to speak about finance tools for coral reef conservation and overview. And before we get started, I just want to let everybody know how to ask questions. There's two ways you can do that. There's the chat panel, which you can type in your questions. You have the option of sending it directly to just the panelists, which is all the people I just named, or sending it to everyone, and either option is fine as long as it's relevant to the topic. And also there's a Q&A, which is just sent privately to the panelists. But both of those work at getting questions to us. So we'll have the presentation by David and Venkat, and then we'll have some time for questions. And then we're also, any questions that we're not able to get to, we're going to handle on the Reef Resilience Network forum. And at the end of the presentation, we'll get you information about how to join the sort of online chat conversation on that forum to continue this. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, David and Venkat.
Thanks very much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here, and just want to do a quick shout out to the International Coral Reef Initiative partner of ours who is put us in touch and is promoting this, as well as the people that have helped put together this paper that a lot of this presentation is based upon. So Venkat, myself, but also Katie Mathias, Ray Victorine, and Melissa Walsh. So what we're going to do today is give a quick overview, an introduction in a way to different tools that are available for conservation finance, specifically focused on coral reef conservation. And when we talk about coral reef conservation, we're talking about coral reef and associated ecosystems, so mangrove, seagrass beds. And so we'll do a brief introduction, set the context. We'll talk about business planning as an essential sort of strategic approach for getting into different finance tools and identifying which ones might be appropriate. And then Venkat's going to take over and give an overview of different finance tools that we have addressed and described and provided some examples for in a paper we recently made public. We'll go into some specific examples of some of these tools, and then we'll end up with some conclusions. And just as a preview is that we're actually planning a few more presentations where we'll get into much more detail on some specific finance tools in the future, and Sarah will tell you about them later. So to start with, we do have available what's called Finance Tools for Coral Reef Conservation, a guide. It is not a how-to guide, but it is a working guide. To a certain extent, it gives you an introduction to different tools. And so the document's a good resource for protected area managers and others who are trying to achieve conservation. And it builds on and adds to another publication that's worth looking at from ICRI and Vertigo Labs called Innovations for Coral Finance. And it's available online at conservationfinancealliance.org or cfalliance.org. So please, if you want more information about what we covered today, go and download the document. So what are some of the conservation actions that we're trying to finance and to use finance tools for? Obviously, the creation and management of protected areas, marine protected areas have proven to be quite effective and are vastly underfunded, and many of which are paper parks, but also sustainable fisheries, restoration of coral reefs, and suppression of external pressures. A lot of coral reefs are under threat from agricultural runoff or a lack of wastewater treatment. So there's all these other issues that affect it, and then trying to achieve sustainable tourism. Obviously, climate change is a big factor for coral reefs due to the warming of the water, and we don't get into climate change finance very much. That's a vast area of information and other expertise, but it's important to remember how important climate change is for success. As I've mentioned before, challenges include insufficient funding to meet the conservation needs. That is caused by an array of issues, mostly the fact that coral reefs are shared resources. They're difficult to see. You can't, they're not as visible as other terrestrial habitats, for example. Other challenges is that the financing tools that are available, a lot of them have been successful in generating revenue, but there's quite a number of different tools, and it may seem overwhelming. There may be capacity limitations on site or in different countries, it's important to have a framework to evaluate your different options. So we're hoping to address some of those challenges here. Business planning. We like to start there because it's really a critical first step. And the guide goes through 13 different finance tools, but also addresses the role of government and donor financing. We look at different case studies, and we have this comparative framework that we use. It's meant to provide an introduction, and it's not an implementation guide. On the right of the slide here, you can see there are a list of the different finance tools that the guide covers, and quite comprehensive. A lot of these have been proven successful terrestrial sites and are recently being used for marine, and Venkat's going to go into each one of those in much more detail. So I'm going to start with some information on business planning, and business plans are useful for a range of different organizations and sites. So let's start with, what is a business plan? It's a written document that's developed through consultation and analysis. It summarizes an entity's plan to achieve their objectives and how to achieve that through sound management and sound financing. So business plans are really important for protected areas, for NGOs, for community organizations, conservation trust funds, or of course they're used for-profit or other businesses. And they're written in a style that potential investors and donors can respect and understand, and are clear. Often they're relatively concise, and they focus on really giving a clear roadmap of what the organization needs to do. So the process itself is set up to achieve several things. One is to support revenue generation and or fundraising by identifying very detailed funding needs and justifying those funding needs with really explicit information. It identifies your donors, your investors, and your resource users as potential sources of financing. It looks at different finance mechanisms and presents those that are likely to be most successful. And it highlights the return on investment. If I make this donation, if I make this investment in this organization or this site, what are the benefits to the site, or what are the economic benefits for people or for conservation? It can also improve organizational effectiveness and planning. When the organization knows what steps they need to do to achieve their stated outcomes, it makes it easier to plan and to implement. It's built on a realistic execution plan that's clearly budgeted. It goes through different scenarios, feasibility analysis, and looks at cost effectiveness of different activities. Oftentimes we continue just to do activities without really thinking about, is this the most cost effective? And just looking at effectiveness helps bring things back to, are we achieving our objectives? And it does usually have a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges, or threats, like a strength and analysis, strength and weakness analysis that where you want to enhance those strengths and minimize the threats and weaknesses. So how does it fit into sort of overall planning for a protected area, for example? I mean, again, this applies to multiple different organizations, and says, so the business plan is can be seen as within the overall management plan. So a management plan may look at all the different science aspects to the issues. It'll have detailed monitoring and evaluation plan, things like that, whereas a business plan is really focused on operations, finance, things like that. Within the business plan, you will also have a finance plan, or you could have a financial plan that's really focused on how we're going to raise the money that we need to achieve our objectives. But ideally, that's all part of the business plan and is integrated. The process is really, really important. It's almost as important or more than important than the results. You are engaged with both internal, so staff and other key partners, board, and external stakeholders. And it's important to include a wide range. You begin with visioning. So what are your aspirations? What do you seek to achieve? What are your specific outcomes and outputs that you seek to address? You build your cost estimates, your budget from the bottom up. Oftentimes we do budgeting when we say, well, look, we have $1 million. What can we do with it? Or last year's budget was 500,000. Maybe we'll get 10% more. What do we do with the 10%? So with the business plan, you really want to say, what are our goals? What are our achievements? And you build the budget from the bottom by looking at what we need to achieve the results. So it should be both realistic and ambitious at the same time. You don't want a plan that it just says, well, we'll just continue on. But what do you need to do to really achieve your objectives? And of course, having indicators to target, this being smart indicators, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound are essential. And it should be considered a living document, something that evolves over time, not something that is fixed. Oftentimes they're written for a 5-year period, for example. Here's a sample outline. There are different business plan outlines out there. This was developed for like conservation trust funds, for example. So you have an executive summary, you have a background area when you discuss the vision, operations and management, then your strategic priorities, looking at your value proposition, maybe a cost-benefit analysis of what you're trying to do, a marketing plan, as I mentioned before, a financial plan where you look at historical finance statements, your financial projections and needs, and how you're seeking to both fulfill those short-term needs and achieve sustainable financing. So we talk about finance mechanisms, tools, solutions. I'm just going to give you some terminology here to think about, and that we often, a lot of these tools are quite complex. There's your finance source, could be a donor or an investor or something, and then that money goes to oftentimes to an intermediary, maybe a conservation trust fund or an NGO that then works with what we call beneficiary or recipient, to take actions that result in your conservation outcomes. And so you could have more than one instrument, one finance instrument in this. For example, a conservation trust fund, obviously quite a complex structure, but they often use a debt swap to get money to come into the fund. Then they'll make investments overseas and use the interest, and then they'll give grants. And so there's like 3 different instruments just right there in one conservation trust fund, and that's a very simple one. So, but a lot of these tools, for example, debt swaps or whatever, will require intermediaries, will require different instruments that work together in consort. So it's important to think about that. And when you're trying to increase your income, it's important to think separately about sources and instruments. For example, at the bottom left corner, if you have an existing instrument and source, you just want to improve the effectiveness or improve the amount of money. Say that you've got an existing donor, you say, go back to the donor and say, look, we need some more, we need twice as much money. So that's the simplest, easiest thing to do. If you go up straight from there to the new source, then you're using your existing instruments, but you're perhaps adding a new donor, adding a new investor, a new type of investor. So that's one way to expand. On the bottom right is a new instrument. So if you come up with something that you're going to add to your arsenal of finance tools, oftentimes it's more challenging. It requires different capacity, and so that's a little bit harder. And then in the top right, both a new source and new instrument. This is a much more challenging than people realize. A lot of these finance tools are complex, and it's really important to, they could increase your revenue significantly, but it's important to understand what capacity is needed to achieve both a new source and new instrument at the same time. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to the more detailed discussions of the different finance tools, and Venkat, you take over, and I'll join you again later on.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon to everybody. I hope everyone can hear me at least reasonably well. If not, mention a comment and maybe I'll start speaking a little bit louder. So as David talked about, this report was, in a way, not necessarily a how-to guide. Okay, someone cannot hear me. Can some people hear me at least?
We can hear you, but it is not as loud as.
Okay, I'll try to speak closer to the mic.
That's good. Yeah, that.
Okay, great. So I guess punching over my laptop is the way to go. Okay, so sorry everybody for the lack of volume. Hopefully it's better now. So as David mentioned, this wasn't a how-to guide per se of making every single financial tool in the business. What we wanted to do was to provide an overview of all the existing financial tools out there, the really cool ones, the innovative ones, the more easier ones to do, to give Reef managers and practitioners a really nice sense of what's available and what they can do to finance their Reef. So we analyzed the options. We'll talk a little bit more about them in a little bit, but we analyzed them in terms of revenue potential, the priorities being addressed. And once again, David mentioned this, but the conservation priorities we referred to were earlier on in this presentation. We're looking at either creation of marine protected areas, sustainable fisheries, or reef restoration, and certainly different mechanisms or tools address different conservation priorities. So that's something that we took a look at in the paper, and kind of between, if you take a look at the paper, you'll see that every tool has got a box or table above it, kind of recommending what priority it could potentially be used for. Now that's not an end all be all, but that's was kind of the gist of what we're trying to do. And then we kind of categorize the tools loosely in terms of ease of implementation. So in this slide, you can see that donations and direct government expenditures and entrance access fees, those are the ones that were slightly easier to implement. And then you kind of go down the road a little bit, and you have bonds and impact investing, trust funds, slightly harder to do. And then certainly the difficult ones to do in terms of reefs or biodiversity offsets or impact bonds or insurance schemes. And these require a lot more technical specialists and a lot more money typically to get some sort of return of investment on the ground. So what we'll do over the next few slides is, obviously we can't go over every single tool in detail, but what we can do is, or at least what we're going to do, is talk about I'll define loosely what we've thought about on each tool, and then give you a case study, a short one, maybe a few lines. And then if you're interested in any particular case study, I strongly urge you to go ahead and read the report, because it's very detailed there, or you can always get in touch with me, David, or any of the authors. So here we go. Next slide, David. Okay, so finance sources, just as a precursor, we wanted just to give everyone in the audience an idea of what the current financing of coral reefs is, and majority of it comes from government funds and donors. So 41%, you can see in this kind of mishmash of different countries we chose from this study, 41% of all refinancing was from government funds, 37% were from donors, and the other was a mixed bag of either the two or something else. Now, just one quick point, you can see developing countries like Tanzania and Vietnam have got very little on the slide, and then the table below, that is, the Tanzania and Vietnam have got very little government funds, but they have a large portion of donor funds that comprise their protected area budget, whereas countries like, more developed countries like France or the United States have much more government funds pushing in towards their protected areas. And that's an aspect of, obviously, much more robust policy and decision-making at the top level for environment at these kind of countries, and obviously more money as well. So we, at least from the financial tools perspective, and given that certainly David and I worked a lot on developing countries as part of WCS, and also I'm currently part of the UN, and typically there we want to shift protected area financing or reef financing away from the donor financing towards non-donor sources. Government is a huge aspect of that because government can provide a huge assistance. They already have the existing financial channels. So if you're a Reef practitioner and you're listening in, government funds is the way to go and probably the easiest thing to do. And if you can't do that, then you start worrying about all the different financial tools required to potentially finance your Reef. So we talked a little bit about donations and philanthropy. There's billions of dollars, certainly from foundations and other donors, multilaterals, et cetera, that go into financing Reef conservation. It's more detailed in the paper. I'm not going to get into this too much. There's so many different foundations involved, but certainly this is a big aspect of conservation. As we all know, the nonprofit and foundation sphere in funding conservation, and particularly in developing countries, is extremely important. Direct government expenditure. So this was a quick analysis done by the CBD, and really, it's not a lot of money. I mean, the percentage of gross domestic product spent on conservation is only about 0.2%. And if that doesn't sound like a lot, it's true. It isn't a lot. Most governments in many, many different economies prefer spending money on education or health or infrastructure or something like that. Environment spending in terms of central government expenditure has never been a lot, typically in most countries that this study looked at. So now we go into more of the easier implementation tools that we spoke about in the paper. Entrance and access fees, I suspect a lot of people are familiar with this. You charge a fee to enter a particular site, charge directly to users of a protected area. These fees vary across the world. We kind of lumped these and special use permits together in one case study for Tanzania. And special use permits are slightly different than fees. I think the technical definition we used was permits have conditionality. So examples such as site permits for particular research or filming or diving or specific access to an area, that's what we termed as a special use permit. And look at Tanzania, for example, they'll charge between $10 to $30 for an entrance fee, but maybe you have to pay $1,000 a week to film on a certain site. That would be a special use permit. Concessions, we looked at concessions as kind of leases or licenses for any operation by any party other than the protected area agency. So many examples of concessions in coral reefs and protected areas across the world. I think we took a look at the Hawaii concession stands. Which I think the government gets about a 10% cut of the concessions, and the concessions obviously are private sector operators on the beach around the reef that make money. So now the medium ease of implementation, and this is where it gets kind of a little harder, particularly for isolated reefs, where with not a lot of maybe frequented visitors and kind of lack of financial channels going directly to the site. But I think that this is an area which has got a lot of potential, because if you can't do the really hard ones coming up in the next slide, this could be kind of your sweet spot to take a look at in the medium or long term. So in the report, we took a look at bonds, in particular, the Seychelles Blue Bond and Resilience Bond. So for those, for definition purposes, and nature bonds, at least, we talked about them as they're financial instruments. So you want to borrow money from investors for projects that conserve and use nature. And the Seychelles Blue Bond in particular was a $15 million debt issue. And this was a loan guarantee from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, I believe, IBRD, and the World Bank. And so what they did in this case was borrow money and invested directly into their fisheries. And this allowed them to, in the future, pay off money once the fisheries reached a certain level. So markets and impact investing. This was a nice reef example done in the Caribbean, in particular by Blue Finance, which is a nonprofit. And this particular public-private partnership is really nice, because what Blue Finance does is that it gets a management contract from government, let's say this case study in Dominican Republic, and they get $1 million from an impact investor. So they have complete management control over the site. And typically this site has got a large amount of tourism in place. And what happens then is that they get the tourists in place, they charge an entrance fee, so they start making money out of the site, and in return pay off their impact investor. And the government is happy because they don't have the technical capacity to manage a site. Blue Finance is doing it for them, and the government, as you can see in this table, responsible for enforcement and regulation and some monitoring, while Blue Finance on the site level does the environmental activities, manages the tourism, does the education. So it's a nice way to kind of make money out of a tourism site, as well as get impact investing coming in directly to the site. And the government is happy because they don't have to spend extra money managing a reef. Conservation trust funds. These are large private, legally independent institutions, catalyzing funding for either grants or specific projects within a site. And in the report, we took a look at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and also the Mesoamerican Reef Fund, the MAR Fund. And both of these two particular trust funds invest or provide grant making to certain activities around reefs or marine protected areas in that region. And typically these trust funds either have a large endowment, which they keep, say, $100 million or so. I believe that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund is around 25 million or so. And to keep the endowment and take the interest out of it and use that for either grant making or project making, or they sink the fund, and that's called the sinking fund, where they take the initial endowment and just keep sinking it year by year into their projects. There's two different ways to do that, and different trust funds have got different ways that they actually utilize their money. And again, you can read more in the report on how these two specific funds exactly work. Taxes and levies, I think in the report, we define them as pretty standard. I mean, they're specifically targeting environmental or conservation related activities, and you pay a tax imposed by the government at a local, state, or national level. The Maldives green tax in particular is a tax payable by tourists, and it's $6 a day for people who visit the Maldives. So that's a nice way that the government collects the money and flushes it back. I'm not sure of the exact portion, right, to send back towards the marine and ocean and reefs, but certainly a significant portion is generated to allow continuation of financing at the site level. And finally, the kind of the harder tools. And one of them is biodiversity offsets, widely used at the moment. This is essential. It's kind of essential in a way because there's so much money involved in biodiversity offsets, and it's basically an instrument that assigns financial liability for environmental damage to developers. And whether it's a large-scale extraction company like a mining company or something more in terms of a development project. And what David will do in a little bit, we'll go a little bit more in detail in the reef case in the Great Barrier Reef. So payment for ecosystem services, PES, is blue carbon, and certainly carbon sequestration is a big topic nowadays on carbon credits, and the mangroves and seagrass sequester quite a bit of carbon around the reef sites. And this is an avenue for potential money making in the future. I will add the caveat though that blue carbon credits are not currently tradable underneath the IPCC, and now also the UNFCCC protocol. So in the future, that's probably going to be added, but at the moment, it's more terrestrial carbon credits that are being traded consistently. There are not that many blue carbon schemes out there. We did provide kind of values in terms of the carbon sequestration value for a few of the things or ecosystems around coral reefs, but this is an avenue that's probably going to be generating revenue more in the future rather than the short term. Impact bonds are also called resilience bonds, and this is something where third-party investors take on the risk of program innovation. So instead of relying specifically on the public, in this case, we provided a water example, although there's also a resilience example of wetlands in Louisiana. In this case, you have private investors such as Goldman Sachs coming in and taking on all the bond, or at least buying up the loan that the government is issuing. And once the water utility is providing a performance impact and providing cleaner water to consumers who are willing to pay a little bit more, then the government can pay back the private investor, and it's called a pay for success scheme. So it's nice that the private sector is incentivized to give a performance goal, and only then they're going to get paid. Debt for nature swaps. This is a multiple party transaction where a debt of a country is forgiven or partially forgiven by its debtors in exchange for certain commitments to biodiversity conservation. So this was a restructuring arrangement finalized in 2018 and funding the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan, where the debt, or at least part of the debt of Seychelles, was forgiven in return by the Nature Conservancy and other partners as well, willing to buy it off in exchange for Seychelles utilizing that money in marine protected areas as well as marine planning, along with fisheries investments. Insurance schemes, this is the first of its kind for coral reefs in Quintana Roo, and this scheme was piloted by Mexico. And it's very similar to a credit card scheme in a way where the hotel owners at the site level in Quintana Roo, where there's millions of tourists, I believe, every year, and there's lots of money to be made. The coral reefs have a technical kind of geeky term called a wave attenuation value, a WAV. And if there's more reefs around a region, they buffer the waves, so there's less storm damage. And so there's an economic benefit to conserving reefs because there's going to be less damage for you in the future. So what this scheme did was Swiss Re, which is a European insurance company, came in and promised the hotel owners a payout, about $20 to $25 million or so if there was storm damage. In return, the hotel owners would have to pay their monthly premium for reef insurance. But the difference between this and regular insurance is that regular disaster insurance, is that this insurance scheme, the premium that the hotel owners were paying, half of it went directly to the site level for reef rehabilitation. So in other words, if the hotel owners kept paying the premiums correctly, a large portion of that money would be used to rehabilitate the reef. Some money would obviously go back to Swiss Re, but the reason that's important is because if there was a storm and there's better reefs, then there's going to be less storm damage. And if there's less storm damage, then the hotel owner's premium doesn't go up as much, because if there was significant storm damage, as anyone who has insurance knows, if you have a car accident, etc., your premium is going to go up. So this is a nice way that incentivizes the hotel owners to keep paying their premiums, because otherwise there's going to be more damage and they're going to have to pay more in the future. And this scheme actually has just been piloted and it's currently ongoing. They're still negotiating the rates, the specific rates, but I believe that most of the contracts have been signed. Conservation enterprise and incubators, this is something that certainly a bunch of NGOs have. Conservation International has one, the Verde Ventures, focusing on debt finance. Several of the institutions have these as well. You have kind of call outs of proposals coming in of small businesses focusing on conservation. And this in particular here, you could talk about fisheries or something like that in regards to reefs, and coming in and these organizations giving them $100,000 or $200,000 or so to jumpstart their business, expecting some sort of extremely minimal return in the future. It's not a lot of money, but certainly money needs to be made in these incubators to some degree for this impact investment. And then, so what I'll finish off with this last slide in terms of just detailing a little bit more of what a resilience bond could look like in terms of reefs, and then David will take it from there, talk a little bit more about offsets. So in the typical resilience bond, what you want to do with a bond is to generate a social and environmental impact, along with a financial return. So you have a bond issuer, typically let's talk about it in terms of the government, and in terms of resilience bonds, in the Louisiana case, where there's a lot of wetlands being extremely important in regards to reducing flooding as well as saline intrusion, you have a situation where the bond issuer, the government, can get a private investor, say a utility, involved or some sort of bank, and providing the upfront capital to the government. And the government can use that money whatever way it likes. But then in this case, you have a situation where the money being used is going towards sustainable fisheries or marine protected areas or tourism or anything of that sort. And the private entity is responsible for actually making sure that the performance of that particular project is successful. Only then will they get the money back from the government in the future at a certain agreed rate. And so this was certainly being done in Louisiana in terms of resilience bonds, the impact bonds we talked a little bit more about in the Washington, D.C. case. And in the future, I don't think there's any current specific reef resilience bond, but I do know that in the future, this could be a direct mechanism, given that the risk insurance scheme worked in Mexico, or at least should work in Mexico, regarding the importance of reefs and reducing storm damage. And then this is something where bonds, certainly the government could step in instead of the private sector and take a little bit on of that risk. So we just wanted to give you that example. And again, it's more detailed in the report. And David, I guess I'm leaving it to you now for the offsets.
Thank you, Venkat. Yeah, so I'm going to just give a bit more background on biodiversity offsets, since they're relatively complex. And the most important thing is that they fit within the mitigation hierarchy. This is an essential element of it. There are over 60 or more countries that already have some kind of legislation, regulation around compensation. So when a private sector or even public sector damages biodiversity, damages the environment, there is some compensation that is required for them. Offsets work under the idea of what's also called no net loss. And the idea is that if you have an impact that's expected from some kind of development activity, a road, a mine, that kind of thing, the first thing that you want to do is try to to avoid that impact, or avoid as much as you can. And so if you can maybe change the location or do something else, that's really the most effective and often the cheapest way to do it. Oftentimes mines can't do that. So what you do then is you try to minimize the impact by improving the engineering of the mine or the road. What happens is usually after the mine or part of the impact assessment, you come up with a rehabilitation or restoration plan that will restore habitat afterwards. But oftentimes, in almost every case, you'll have some sort of residual impact that you can't avoid with this development. And so the idea of an offset is to achieve no net loss, at least by offsetting that residual impact. And there's many different approaches for that. There are places where you have to design an impact very specifically for every specific project, is because different habitat is of course different, has different species, and so you want to have a very specific offset. Otherwise, you could. There are some cases, in the extreme example, where you basically can pay into a fund. In many cases, though, companies are trying to produce a net positive impact. So you do more than just offset your residual impact, but you actually create a greater offset to have a net positive impact. So you compare your business as usual scenarios and say, well, look, if we protect this area, it would have otherwise been destroyed. And so you can get this net positive. And there's also additional conservation activities that are not related to footprints that companies can enter into, so that you can really have a positive impact. And in the Great Barrier Reef, Melissa Walsh and colleagues put together this thing called an offset calculator that, based on 6 what they call surrogates, they're able to calculate what the restoration cost per unit is, and then there's different multipliers and delay factors that will result in a risk-adjusted cost. And these it enables companies that are having these residual impacts to identify what that cost would be. They pay that into a fund that then is charged with achieving the conservation outcomes that are related to the residual impact. So again, there's all different approaches in the U.S. Obviously, there's tradable credits, not tradable credits, but there's credits that can be created and that are purchased by developers. Very rigorous system. So I want to come to a few conclusions now, so we have lots of time for questions. There are a lot of options out there. There are a lot of tools, as Venkat was saying. Some of them are well known, but still not implemented everywhere. And just even entrance fees and the different concession fees. These are sources for local revenue generation. The money can oftentimes be retained at the site level and used directly for conservation, but they're not being implemented across the board as they should be. So when you think about your options, you do want to look at what your organizational capacity is, and in many cases you want to try to build that capacity up, often by bringing people that have more knowledge of finance in. You want to look at the feasibility of the different ideas, different tools. What's the likelihood of success? Are there red flags that would tell you to stop? What's the potential financial impact? Is this going to be significant? Are we going to generate a lot of money? Is the tool compatible with our mission? Because some approaches might have environmental and social impacts. There are places, examples of the Netherlands, for example, has a lottery. Is that compatible with the social mission of the organization, for example? And is the economic model, does it help align incentives, as we've seen before? And then what's the return on investment? Are there heavy startup costs? What's the operational profitability? payment for ecosystem services schemes can often have high transaction costs. And then what are the risks associated with it? So those are different priorities. Another thing to think about is the diversity. There's no one solution that's going to be a silver bullet that solves all your financing problems. So it's risky to focus on a single stream of funding. And often, as we've seen from the different sources of financing that Venkat was showing before, you want to combine different sources because specific mechanisms like entrance fees are often insufficient to achieve total funding of what you need. And then, as I mentioned before, the different mechanisms often work in concert with one another to generate or leverage funds. A term blended finance is being used quite a bit now because it combines some donations with concessional loans and other things. And so we look to make packages. So in the end, you want to have a mix of finance solutions that addresses these four sort of points: finance, risk management, planning, and integration. Finance being, is it financially adequate, can address the needs? Risk management, is it a diverse set of solutions that can be resilient to shocks and challenges? Planning, is the timing, are you going to spend 5 years developing a trust fund when you need the money today? And maybe more grant funding would be more appropriate. So mixing short and long-term solutions, and then integration. How do these finance solutions contribute to your overall goals of sustainable development? So in the end, you'll have perhaps a mix. Obviously, these are not equally diverse, but you may have a package of solutions for every site, and then of course for systems of protected areas or different coral reef areas, you'll have quite a range of different mechanisms. And so we'll end there, and we'll open it up for some questions. I'm sure you've had a few, and just wanted to give a shout out for us at the Conservation Finance Alliance. Please sign up, join us, and read our newsletter. And thanks again to all our partners and donors. And now I'm going to pass it back over to Sarah.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to, well, first of all, remind everyone how to ask questions. You can type them into the chat and send them, and you can type them into the Q&A. Somebody has their hands raised. It'd probably be better if you can type the question, but if you can't type the question, just ping me and I can see about unmuting you. Then I wanted to let everyone know, Sherry, if you wanted to describe it, after we finish up today's webinar, we'll be continuing this conversation. You'll still have the chance to ask questions through the Reef Resilience Network Forum.
Yes,
and if you want to just describe what people do.
Sure, yeah, no problem. Thanks, Sarah. This is Sherry Wagner from the Reef Resilience Network. Hi, everyone. So we encourage you to continue the conversation. We have a online discussion forum, which is an interactive online community of coral reef managers and practitioners from around the world, and I'm sure some of you are already members. So all you need to do is to go to the link on the screen and log in or join the forum. You just have to fill in a little registration form, and then you'll see I will post some of the questions that we don't get to, and you're also free to continue the conversation there with some other questions. So thanks.
Okay, great. And and also talking about continuing the discussion, we're going to have another iteration of this webinar in about 8 hours. If you know of people who should be attending, you can, hopefully you have the link. If not, you can contact us at ebmtools@natureserve.org, the same email address, or just reply to your webinar invite, and we can send you the link to the later webinar today if there's other people you think should attend that one, and there's also a recording. In addition, we're going to have 2 additional webinars that are going to explore some of these topics in more depth. The first one will be exploring the tourism-related tools in more depth, and those webinars will be on July 17th and 18th, depending on where you are in the world, and I posted the links, registration to those in the chat. And then we're going to have a third set of webinars on conservation trust funds and public-private partnerships. And those will be October 2nd and 3rd, but we haven't created the links yet. So just reply to your webinar invitation if you want to get more information about those. Okay, so let's see, we have questions. First of all, let's start with, what is the range of negotiations for insurance in Mexico?
Sorry, just to repeat that question, what is the range?
Yeah, yeah, so actually, Nohari, if you wanted to send a little bit more detail about that, just to learn more about, I think, the negotiations for the insurance.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of well, I guess if the question, if I'm presuming correctly, is asking for a number of the range of insurance premiums, from my understanding, it's still
Yes, that was the question too.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So from my understanding, it's still under the negotiation phase. The payout, again, as I mentioned, is 25 million. In terms of the exact premium that each hotel owner has to pay every month, it's a good question. I think, and please don't quote me on this, but I think it's somewhere in the range of 500 to 1,500 or so. I would think that was the loose number mentioned by the TNC folks. And maybe they've updated it or maybe they've completely scratched it. But again, as I said, that number is by each hotelier, and half of the money goes towards reef rehabilitation.
Okay, thank you, Venkat.
Yeah.
Let's see, a question. I'm interested in knowing if there are funds available to do research on the sargassum issue occurring in the Caribbean, because this has a big impact on the health of coral reefs and seagrasses, plus marine animals. I would say I'm not aware of anything specifically targeted at this. I don't know if it's, if anybody else is. It sounds like several of our participants would love to know about that. And David and Venkat, do you have any leads on that?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Okay.
No.
And that do I. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Then there's another question. Has the Louisiana example been successful? Does the state of Louisiana plan more financing schemes like this for further restoration work? Why did Louisiana use this type of financing?
Venkat, do you want to address that? Or?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
My computer froze for a second. I can take a little bit of that and maybe David can follow up. The Louisiana resilience bonds are actually a unique case. I mean, not unique case in a way that there's private sector involved, but they've done a little bit in terms of the restoration initiatives by private sector, taken it on by themselves in some way. For example, not just in terms of resilience bonds, maybe this is a slight tangent, then I'll get back to the question, but there's also several restaurants in Louisiana, for example, that take the shells out of their, the shellfish used and put it back in certain areas where it rehabilitates the ocean and the wetland and prevents erosion. So I think there's a lot of private sector involvement in Louisiana that helps facilitate these kind of transactions in terms of boosting nature as well as making money out of it. Now, in terms of the government doing more stuff like this in the future, I think the answer is yes, because the resilience examples, at least that I've seen, seem to be working well from a money generation standpoint, because there's significant flood reduction and less saline intrusion by actually keeping these wetlands intact. In terms of the exact monetary value of these wetlands, it's always different, and it's always different in different places, but there's a significant amount of money to be made, ranging in the millions of dollars. David, do you want to continue with that?
No, I think you covered it well, but just to note that there was, Louisiana has, there has a lot of money that came from the Deepwater Horizon spill that I think is also kind of been used to help restoration and that kind of thing. So it may be a special case down there.
Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. There was a question as whether you have any examples of these sorts of financial tools being used in Indonesia.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think that the financial tools that I've seen in Indonesia have been primarily about fisheries management plans and improving coastal fisheries as well as improving marine protected area sustainability in regards to fisheries. And at least that's the work that I've seen WCS do. David, have you seen anything else?
Well, yeah, there's conservation trust funds there, and they're doing some quite innovative work, Kaheti, with investments, and yeah, I'm not sure how the entrance fees work, but I know that they have parks have entrance fees, so they have some of the basic tourism solutions there. They just issued a very large type of green bond. I think that's and everyone's currently looking into how to access some of that money for more biodiversity focused activities. So Indonesia is actually quite, and of course they had a big project with Red Plus, so carbon, which I don't think involved marine at all, but Indonesia is quite advanced in these, and an interesting place to work. I think great opportunities there.
Okay, thank you. We have another comment/question. Thank you for a very informative and interesting talk. I was wondering what the typical obstacles are for MPA managers and investors. What are typical difficulties that MPA managers face in making business and financial plans that attract potential investors?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's so many, but one of the biggest challenges is revenue. So revenue generation. A lot of these different, private sector related tools like bonds require some sort of revenue generation. Now, there's two types of bonds. One, you can have sovereign bonds, so it's the government that pays it back, which was the case for Seychelles, for example. So in that case, the revenue can be just improved tax revenue. So if you improve the economy through improved tourism, for example, then money does flow back to the government. But to get impact investors, for example, to say invest in a protected area, you really need a clear revenue source. So and then of course there's all the challenges of the fact that a lot of these sites are shared resources and complicates access to the site use regulations and community interactions, which of course make it more challenging. But there's a lot of innovation happening. In the case we mentioned, blue finance is an interesting approach.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Another question: both a debt for nature swap and a blue bond were executed for the Seychelles. Why are blue bonds easier to implement than debt for nature swaps? How might they work in sync or address different issues in the country? And more broadly speaking, is one better for a certain type of conservation program versus another?
Another interesting question. Venkat, should I take this?
Did you want to take it or should I?
Up to you.
Maybe I can start, and David, you
go ahead.
Can add on. In terms of comparing blue bonds and debt for nature swaps, the majority of debt for nature swaps occurred in the 90s, and that was, there's not that many that
Venkat, can you get closer to your mic again?
Sorry. Yeah, so I was saying, in terms of comparing blue bonds and debt for nature swaps, the majority of debt for nature swaps occurred in the 90s when a lot of Western-based economies were willing to kind of take away the debt of lots of developing countries and move that debt towards environmental protection programs. They're not that common anymore in terms of actual quantity. And in some sense, that kind of explains why a blue bond is a little bit easier, right? Because the bond, if it's a national issue, as David was talking about, then the government can kind of take direct responsibility for its own investments. Debt for nature swaps are not all that easy to do. Remember that if another economy or another country is willing to come in and take away your debt, there's going to be a lot of monitoring in place. And USAID did a lot of this in the 90s in Africa. But it's just difficult. You got to monitor, make sure the programs are being implemented and all of that, which is why the Seychelles case is one of the relatively rare cases of debt for nature swaps over the last 10 years. So David can add on to that.
If I can unmute myself. Oh, I am unmuted. Great. I just want to point out that TNC is just launching a very ambitious program to implement debt for nature, debt conversion, what they're calling, not instead of debt for nature, but debt conversion programs in a lot of countries. I think their goal is like 10 or so in the next few years. And it only works in countries where debt is under threat. So if the country has a debt burden that it's having trouble paying back, that creates the opportunity for the debt swap. Whereas a bond can be used by any country. And there's been a huge explosion in green bonds. There I don't know how many. I don't know what the annual sale is, but I think it's around 300 billion these currently in green bonds. Not a lot going to nature, but a lot going to renewable energy and things like that have revenue streams to pay it back. But as I mentioned before, you could have a sovereign bond that can be very focused on nature. So these are and it's irrelevant. That actually the better credit the country has, the cheaper the bond offering is. So it's a really interesting option.
Just to follow up on that, there was a question that came in. Do you know if any other places than the Seychelles are developing blue bonds, and how far along are they? Are you able to share any specifics about any countries?
I know that a lot of countries are talking about them, but I don't know any country that's advanced on it significantly.
Okay. I wanted to ask, we have a couple more from folks, but I wanted to ask a question. What is the sort of ecosystem of places that people can go to for help in thinking about these issues? Is it sort of private consulting, NGOs? Like, what are some resources you would suggest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's actually relatively limited information. The Conservation Finance Alliance in 2002 produced a conservation finance guide. We have put that legacy guide up online at conservationfinance.info. But again, it dates back. We're in the process of updating that, but the material available now is quite old. Different organizations have information online. For example, there's a whole bunch of information the TNC has on water funds. There's a whole toolkit for that. There's also I want to point out the Biodiversity Finance Initiative from UNDP, as well as a website from UNDP on sustainable development finance. That website has around 22 or more sort of 5-page introductions to a lot of these different finance tools, and those are all up to date and have great links and great information. They do cover a lot of these issues, including bonds, for example, and trust funds, but they're not focused on the marine environment, and they're a little bit more generalized for sustainable development. But a lot of them were done with biofin, and so they are focused on nature to a certain extent.
Okay, all right. Thank you, David. That's helpful. So let's see. We are going to wrap up now, but I again wanted to let people know that this conversation is going to move to the Reef Resilience Network Forum, and the information is up there at forum.reefresilience.org/network. So there'll be further discussion with David and Venkat and Sherry on this forum. There's also going to be a webinar in 8 hours covering the same information if there's people you think should hear it live, and then a recording will be made. And then there'll be 2 more sets of webinars to cover some of these topics in more detail. So those are additional sources of help. But thank you, everyone. And so thank you so much, David and Venkat. We so appreciate you coming here to speak about this. And before we go, I just wanted to again thank ICRI, the International Coral Reef Initiative, who provided funding. And thank you to everyone who was able to attend. We really appreciate you being here. And if you have questions, this was a really interesting use of the chat where lots of information flowed from all sorts of sources, which is great. If you have any questions, you can just reply to the address with your webinar information, and we can see if we can get you the information you want to follow up on any of these resources. Okay, thanks everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.